This video will help you understand the psychological terms and theories of projection, introjection, and transference in daily school life. These are terms and theories that we use in therapy and counselling a lot to help us understand our relationships with children, to help understand the dynamics, and also importantly, to understand our feelings as professionals and how they can impact us when building relationships with children. We tend to think of relationships with children from a one-sided perspective. We think a lot about the child's behaviour, how the child might be feeling, but it's actually equally important to think about our own feelings and our own experiences. And when we can understand our own feelings, that really helps us to improve those relationships with children, especially very vulnerable children who may have experienced neglect and abuse, and they can often provoke very difficult feelings in us. So these terms are really useful to use when thinking and talking about children, and really important to catch those times when we find ourselves talking constantly about a child's behaviour. That's often a common sign that we may need to start thinking about our own behaviour and our own thoughts and our own feelings about that child. So, firstly, projection is an unconscious process where an individual attempts to rid themselves of unwanted feelings by projecting them onto others. So we tend to use this term fairly commonly now. I think it's kind of becoming part of the vernacular. For example, I can't manage my angry feelings, so I think everyone else is angry, or I experience everybody else as angry with me. That's when I can't manage those angry feelings. Introjection is the unconscious adoption of the ideas or attitudes of others. So this is when adults tell me I'm bad, so I believe I'm bad. And often in schools, without sort of realizing and knowing, we can make comments about children's behavior, and we can use statements such as, that they are difficult or challenging, or that we are fine, they drive us mad, things like that. We've all said it. But when children hear those kind of statements, they can then take in those signals about their behavior and adopt them fully, and take them on as part of their identity, which we really don't want. We want to separate the child's behavior from who they are. So even if they may be behaving in a challenging way, which of course they can be, and of course that must be very frustrating for you, that we don't say that they are frustrating, we say that their behavior is frustrating. So it's important to make that difference. Language is very important. And lastly, transference, which is when we relate to others as though they are people from our past. And this is a Freudian term, and commonly the most common type of transference, or that we tend to think about the most, is parental transference, so mother and father. And that can be a neutral thing, or it can be a good thing when we've had positive or neutral relationships with our parents and carers. It can be more challenging and more complex when we have had difficult relationships, or if there has been abuse or neglect within those relationships. And children can often come into school, if they have come from difficult circumstances, then they can bring that pattern of relationship into school with them and relate to you in that way. So just something to be mindful of and bear in mind. Some examples of projection. So a teacher struggles with their own feelings of shame, and when a child in their class does something wrong, they can be overly punitive and feel a sense of enjoyment from the child's mistakes. So if they are wrong, I am right. So that adult gets to avoid their own feelings of shame by punishing them in children. So that's actually a fairly common one, not just within schools, but that, people who really enjoy and love to be right tend to be maybe avoiding that shameful feeling of being wrong, have gotten something wrong, and what being wrong or feeling wrong means to them. Another example, a child misbehaved the previous day, and when they arrive at school the next morning, their LSA says, "We're going to have a better day today than yesterday." So this immediately reminds the child of their wrongdoing and makes it more likely that they'll do it again. The adult is unconsciously, and that's really important, nobody does this intentionally, it's all unconscious, is projecting their feelings of frustration onto the child. And unwittingly, I think probably making it quite likely that the behaviour is going to happen again. So adults can provoke children to behave in challenging ways, because it's easier to manage that aggressive, destructive, challenging behavior in the child rather than in ourselves. So important to catch the when we're saying things like that to children. And again, it's important to be kind to ourselves and not to be overly punitive with ourselves, because we do all say these things and we do all project constantly. But it's about bringing it into awareness, being reflective, having it as part of our discussions and conversations. So some examples of introjection. A looked after child who was abused by their parents expresses their trauma through their behaviour. When they feel unsafe or threatened, they become aggressive and destructive. Adults often say things like, "If you are a good boy, you can go out to play." Inevitably, the child can't manage their feelings and gets their play removed. Then they think, "I must be bad." So there's a couple of different things happening here. First of all, the adults are sort of setting up the child to fail because it's unlikely that the child is going to be able to manage their own behavior, and that's not their fault. That's physiologically, psychologically what they can manage. They can't regulate themselves and manage those feelings. And then it's about saying that they're a good boy. If they are a good boy, then you can have this thing and you can go out. So I think it's really important to separate the behavior from the child so that we're not labeling the child as either good or bad, but we are acknowledging that the behavior is separate from them. So it would be more helpful to say, even though it would not be, it still isn't going to work because the child can't manage their own feelings. But if you were to say, if you can manage your feelings, if you can cope with those feelings, if you can, if I can help you to stay calm until playtime, then we can go out to play together. But ultimately, the idea of rewarding them for behaving well in this instance, where we know there was a significant amount of trauma and abuse, that's not going to be the best way of dealing in this situation. And ultimately, the child is left feeling, because they can't manage those feelings, "I must be bad." So we really want to avoid that and make sure that we're setting our expectations for what a child can manage and really taking into account children's experience of trauma, that we're really thinking about that as well and understanding what they're communicating through that behavior. A child with learning difficulties struggles to focus in the classroom. Adults often become frustrated and say, "You're never going to get anywhere if you don't listen." Again, something we would all say to children. It's really frustrating when they don't listen. The child becomes increasingly anxious and less able to focus. So I think, again, this is about what they are able to cope with and what they are able to tolerate. That child is unable to focus due to their learning difficulties. So they're not making an intentional choice. There's something about the environment or, what's happening in their brain and their body that makes it difficult for them to listen. And although, yes, that is frustrating and we have to acknowledge that within ourselves, you can see that in this instance, it makes the child really, really anxious and even less able to focus. So it's in both of these situations, the language is doing more harm than good. A more useful question might be, "I wonder why you find it so hard to listen. I wonder what would help you to listen better," to think with them and also to empower them to think about what's going to be supportive for them. Because what we don't want that child to take in is the idea that they are stupid or that they can't learn. We want them to really to be able to kind of adopt that growth mindset, to be able to think about how they can work through issues and problems like struggling to listen, struggling to focus, how they can problem solve that with you. But they're definitely going to need your support to do that. And lastly, some examples of transference, which can be either negative or positive. So a child whose parent was emotionally unavailable due to postnatal depression is often disruptive and noisy during lessons. They communicate to you through their behavior that they need to be very boisterous in order to get your attention. So that child is replicating the way that they would have behaved with their parent with you in the classroom. And although it doesn't really make sense, and I know it's incredibly frustrating when children are interrupting, being loud, being noisy in lessons, but it's really helpful to think about, oh, what is this child communicating to me through that behavior? And in a positive sense, a child who has a secure attachment with their parents is able to ask you for help and accept it when they need it. So we can see in that instance that the child is replicating that pattern of relationship that they'd had with their parents, and they are trusting and they're able to reach out, and they understand that when they ask for help, it's most likely that you're going to be able to respond to that need and to help them. So it can be both a positive thing and a negative thing. I hope that's been useful.